What's up, everybody? This was kind of weird earlier in the week. I heard quite a few people talking about this. All of the monitoring buoys out in the South Atlantic just started going off and registering 80-meter waves. And I haven't found any reports saying that South Africa's been taken out, so I believe them when they say it was a glitch. But it is weird because you're talking about multiple buoys here all registering something about the size of Texas, and it was tracking north for 3 or 4 days here. And it's really weird that it's staying the same size. If there were an undersea landslide or something, then it would be expanding. I don't know. Maybe it's tracking the eclipse shadow 3 days late. Definitely strange, but it reminded me of a story I talked about a few years ago, did a video on it, and then kind of forgot about it. But if this is true, then it'd have a huge impact on our understanding of the early days of the Western world and the Americas. I hesitate to call it a discovery because it may have been more of a reconnaissance mission. And this would even help to explain why there's a thick layer of rubble all over all the ancient buildings of America. They say that this tsunami stranded ships 700 feet above sea level over in the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand area. But if there was a 700-foot wave over there, then it would affect America big time. Do you think a 700-foot wave would be enough to connect an island to mainland permanently? I tell you, I've been all over the desert Southwest, and I'm standing by my belief that that was all carved out by water. When you're out there on top of these mesas and you look across, you see that all of the tops of them are level. So I think the ground level used to be hundreds of feet higher, and this has all been carved out. And if you've got millions of cubic miles of earth carved out, it's got to go somewhere. And that somewhere could be the states of Nevada and Arizona connecting California to the mainland. The island of California and the Sierra Nevadas is right where California is today, and that channel of water ran right down through here. I don't know, just a theory, but when you zoom in down here to Cajon Pass, you see that all of the desert seemed to flow down to this choke point, and that's just happens to be where you go from like 5,000 foot high desert down into the California coastlands. And the story is a possible catalyst for all of that continental remodeling. Even the Chinese had California as an island, and they show Lake Cannabis up in the mountains there as well. Anyway, here's what we got going on. There are shipwrecks found way, way above sea level all over the place from an alleged mountain-sized wave back around 1400s. And what's even crazier is the Chinese had built up a huge armada of like 1,000 ships and were pretty well poised to take over the world, including the Americas. And keep in mind, this is several decades before Columbus. And evidently, a huge portion of the fleet was wiped out due to this event. So there's a lot going on here at a really important time in world history. I've always thought that there's more to the story of Cortez walking in and just taking over all of modern day Mexico, and then Pizarro going down to Peru and doing the exact same thing. I guess I need to order the book because what Gavin Menzies is claiming happened here would shed a very different light on American history. My evidence for this lays way over in the South Pacific by Australia, of course. But the way I'm looking at it is if there was a 700-foot wave over here, it would have some momentum going by the time it got to America. So the book 1421 contends that Emperor Shu Di had sent fleets to the Southern Ocean to determine the precise position of the star Canopus. The Chinese needed this information to establish accurate latitudes and longitudes in the Southern Hemisphere. After writing the book, people from 130 countries around the world started sending him more information on this, and he had underestimated the scale of their armada. They were almost 1,000 ships strong. 800 arrived at Calicut alone. Now, that dwarfs all European armadas of the time. The admiral in charge of this whole navy is Zhang He, and his records show that 4 different fleets had chartered Antarctica by 1420, and then it describes a catastrophe which overtook the fleets which had sailed south of New Zealand down to Campbell Island and Auckland Island. The Moreke group of wrecks, some of which are impaled upside down in the cliffs, is consistent with waves dumping them either on top of or into the cliffs. Over the years, the cliffs have crumbled, allowing us to see the wrecks emerging and cannonballs and counterweights dropping out. So, this pretty well impelled them into the mountains. So, I want to point out when you have water sufficient to carve out, huge amounts of earth, it becomes like the consistency of concrete. It's very thick, rocks in it, trees, everything. And I think that's consistent with what we see all across Mexico and Central America. But so by the time it gets to where you're finding the ships, it is just this concrete mud. So the ships are found inside the new top layer of the mountain. The Western Fleet had maneuvered to avoid Snares Island and was some 20 miles to the west of the Eastern Fleet when the wave hit. The giant waves hurled the fleet northwest to Australia. Speaking in broad terms, there are 9 groups of wrecked ancient wooden ships with Chinese characteristics in Australia. He lists a lot of sites over on the east side of the island: Sydney, Byron Bay, Green Cape. But then there's one all the way over in Flinders Bay on the far west side. Along the New South Wales coast, tsunami debris, including blue and white ceramics — if you've ever seen traditional fine china, it's blue and white — is found in deposits with run-ups of over 130 meters. So that's about 400 feet in this location. Another location they're estimating was up to 700 feet. Now we'll talk about what could have possibly caused that here in a minute. And could you imagine a 400-foot wave smacking into the coastline here? I mean, that would probably move the continent. The Byron Bay group has 14 shipwrecks. 3 of these wrecks are ashore, 1 in deep water, and the rest along the 30-fathom deep line. This is where the continental shelf goes from deep water to 30 fathoms deep, much more shallow. The tsunami has incredible amounts of energy in deep water moving through there, and when it shallows up to the 30 fathoms, that's where it shapes up into a monster. Then you have the Newcastle group, 12 wrecks between 65 fathoms and the shoreline. The Sydney group, 16 wrecks, once again at the 30 fathom line, which, by the way, a fathom is about 2 yards. So this was basically sinking all the ships between 60 and 120 yards deep. At the approaches to the Barrier Reef near Fraser Island, a cache of Chinese artifacts have been found near a wreck from which cannons protrude at very low spring tides. And I want to point out that technology was much more advanced than Hollywood would lead you to believe for the 1400s. And these Chinese ships were no joke. I mean, it seems like they were miles ahead of Europe at the time. Their treasure ships, as they call them, were like 450 feet long, and this is one compared to the Mayflower. They had 60 private cabins in the back for the nobility. These are the flagships of the Armada, but they're traveling with a whole fleet of warships, troop transports, cargo haulers, and it's a big, sophisticated enterprise that they were involved in here. All in all, there are over 100 shipwrecks in this general area that can be reasonably argued to belong to this Chinese fleet. So the physical evidence is there to corroborate Zheng He's account of what happened. What could have caused 700-foot high waves? You think there's an underwater landslide? Well, not according to Zheng He, not according to the mythology of the local islanders. And I'll give you one last clue. Some of these shipwrecks that are up on top of mountains are half burned. Do underwater earthquakes usually burn ships? Probably not. This is a painting of a fire goddess. In some areas, it's known as a fire god. And it's depicted looking down on this humanoid winged creature, half bird, half man, with these fiery hands, known as Mahuika, the fire god who lives in the underworld, in addition to being the grandfather of Maui. I'm sure everybody's heard of Maui. And Maui wrestled him in order to win the secret of making fire. So, lives in the underworld, makes fire. She is also said to have played a role in the formation of Rangitoto Island, asking Ruamoko, the god of earthquakes and eruptions, to destroy a couple that had cursed her. So they already had this god Ruamoko, the god of earthquakes and eruptions. So there's your volcano god. So Mahuika is separate from the god of earthquakes and volcanoes. But Mahuika got Ruamoko involved in all of this. Mahuika also has 5 children who are named after the 5 fingers on the hand. So let's put all that together. You've got a fiery hand flying up above who now lives in the underworld and caused a bunch of earthquakes and eruptions and even an island to form, as well as a huge tsunami that caused hundreds of ships to be shipwrecked all over this area. So what are we talking about here? Well, I'm guessing this is probably pretty obvious to almost everybody, except for flat earthers, and that's why I saved this for last, to show how religious dogma can blind you from obvious truths. The most logical explanation here is that a big fiery hand crashed into the ocean, causing devastations that were known for generations to come, otherwise known as an impact event. What, you think rocks fall from the sky? Well, what, you think rocks just melt on their own out in the middle of a field and are of a different composition of everything else around? Or that tektites, which are small melted rocks that can be found in debris fields for hundreds of miles around, was just some NASA shill out there with a Zippo lighter? Or what about the Tunguska event? Did everybody just imagine seeing a bright light in the sky when all the trees got really tired and decided to take a nap? I mean, you seriously got to put your head pretty deep in the sand to ignore all the evidence out there. But I know a lot of people will. Y'all need to get one of those "where's the curve" guys to come up with a theory of the firmament breaking off or something. Because there's impact craters and physical evidence all over the place. And just like the Tunguska event, part of Zheng He's fleet witnessed this impact. One thing I noticed a long time ago is all of the impact craters are in deserts. Why would that be? Well, I think it's because these things are so hot that they literally vaporize all organic matter and just leave you with pretty much sterile sand. But if any of you flat earthers do have an alternative explanation for all of this, plus a lot more evidence, then I'd love to hear it. 2 separate scientists, one in 2003, one in 2007, have confirmed a impact crater 20 kilometers in diameter, 250 kilometers southwest of New Zealand. They named this the Mahuika impact crater after the fire god, because they did the same thing I did. When I went to type in Mahuika, the prompt said Mahuika fire goddess, and I said, there's a clue. So these researchers obviously heard of the myths from the locals and said, well, yeah, they tell of an impact event. Now, he does a pretty good write-up on a visual of what actually happens in a scenario like this, and I think everybody underestimates how hot and how violent this is. By my research, most of these cosmic invaders airburst before ever getting to the ground, but something that left a 20-kilometer crater 300 meters deep in the water is like having a red-hot ball of iron the size of San Francisco fall into the water. But according to Menzies' research, the fireball was seen more than 1,000 miles away. The heat and the flash would have blinded most of the crew before setting their skin on fire. I'll also add that the hypersonic shockwave of this would, at the very least, blow your eardrums out. It would probably concuss you, if not more. The resulting tsunami was more than 700 feet high when it reached Stewart Island further in the north. The wind's maximum velocity would have been around 400 miles an hour. The kinetic energy of an event like this is just about unimaginable, but the records of Zheng He say that his fleet got wiped out by a comet. Now, they believe in the mandate of heaven, so that when an act of God happens, they assume that it is coming from God in heaven. And since they had a fleet of 1,000 ships out ready to start basically taking over the world and it got wiped out by a comet, they decided that God didn't want them doing this and banned any ships having more than one mast. And this all ties in with the Portuguese. This was around 1421. The Portuguese made their first trip down around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa in 1488, trying to reestablish trade with the Eastern world. So if you saw my video about Constantinople and the fall of the Silk Road, this is all connected. And reports of a 700-foot wave in the Southern Pacific gives me a little bit of ammunition for my theory on what happened to the Americas. So we'll have to revisit that in the future. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you guys on the next one. Static out.